Learning Objective 4 is all about the legislation and the regulations that relate to information. Its storage, its transmission, its use, its surveillance, and so on. So it's a big, big topic. It's important that you understand these laws. If there are any further things within these laws, any principles, characteristics, and so on, you need to be familiar with what they are. There is almost always, in fact, I think on every single exam, there has been at least one question on legislation and regulation, and they're quite often quite a big chunk of the mark. So it might be an 8-mark question or a 10-mark question, or it might be a 2-mark question followed by 2 4-mark questions. It's normally a rather large chunk of the exam is this section on the law. So it's important that we understand and we know what they are. So not only do we need to know what these laws are, we also need to understand what the impact this legislation has and what the consequences are of UK organisations if they breach these standards. If there is a problem, if the law is broken, if the regulations aren't followed, what does that mean for them? And also, what can these organisations do to ensure that they are complying with the law and the regulatory requirements so that they don't get into any kind of trouble and people who work for them don't get into trouble either deliberately or accidentally. Because you are now, especially in terms of the new Data Protection Act, it's no longer the individual who is responsible, it's the organisation. So it's a big deal for organisations that they're following these laws. So let's have a little bit of a look at what these are. Okay, so what I've listed here, first of all, are the 6 principles of the GDPR. You'll notice in the specification it talks about the Data Protection Act, and if you've done any IT or computing at GCSE, you will have come across the Data Protection Act. That was updated in May, I think 2018, and it's now, it's still the Data Protection Act, but it's no longer the old version, it's now the new version, which incorporates the GDPR. So these are the 8 principles of the Data Protection Act were changed and they were basically rewritten and updated, and they are now the 6 principles of the GDPR, but they're very, very similar. They're just more stringent than they were before. So you need to be familiar with what the principles of the GDPR are, what the Data Protection Act protects people from and why it protects them, and what the consequence is if the organisation fails to follow the law. So we've got the Data Protection Act of 1998/2018. We also have the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. So you need to understand REPA, and you need to understand what that covers and what that means for organisations. You got the Protection of Freedoms Act, which was written in 2012. What's all that about? You need to understand privacy and electronic communications regulations, which was updated and amended in 2011. The Freedom of Information Act often confuses people, so you need to understand who does this apply to, what kind of organisations, what kind of information are we talking about, how do you get hold of this information, and why is it freedom of information? Why is this information available to people who request it? You've got the Computer Misuse Act of 1990. So again, if you've done GCSE computing or you've done IT at Key Stage 4, you've probably come across the DPA and the CMA, because these are the 2 main laws that we tend to cover at GCSE. The Information Commissioner's Office is an office of the government that exists to help organisations if they're uncertain that what they're about to do in terms of sharing their information is legal or not. They can go to the ICO website and they can get further information about, the Data Protection Act, the Computer Misuse Act, and they can find out, well, what's the situation if we have to deal with a country that doesn't have a Data Protection Act? What if we want to send information to a country that has a Data Protection Act, but it's not strong enough? What do we do if we want to move into the cloud, but the cloud is in another country and they don't have the same data protection regulations as the UK or the European Union? And the ICO will give advice to organisations about what to do in these circumstances. We have the Copyright Design and Patents Act, which again sometimes is covered as part of GCSE. So you should have a little bit of understanding of what that is and what that covers and what that looks like. Okay. And finally, we have the EQA, or the Equality Act, which covers things like discrimination on the grounds of gender or age and so on. So you need to be familiar with each of these laws. You need to be familiar with what's covered by these laws. And specifically the Data Protection Act, you need to understand these 6 principles. And for the Equality Act, you need to know what the protected characteristics are that are covered by that law. So let's have a quick look at the kind of question you're likely to get on the exam. So you can see straight away, it's 10 marks out of the possible 80 that you're going to get on this exam. So it's a large percentage. It's a big chunk of marks to drop if you don't really know your stuff. You'll also notice here that it's one of these starred questions, which means they're looking for the logical structure, clever reasoned argument, supporting examples and evidence. They're looking for your knowledge and understanding here in this type of question. So the question asks us, discuss how the Equality Act should be considered when a school is using records to select staff for promotion. So it's a 10-mark question, but we do have some clues as to what they're looking for. First of all, we're dealing with the Equality Act and the protected characteristics. We're talking about a school, we're talking about staff, and we're talking about promotion. So all of the answers to the question should relate to the school, the staff who work at the school, issues surrounding promotion, and what needs to be considered that is covered by legislation in the Equality Act. There's enough space here for you to be able to write your answer. Okay, so the exam board will normally suggest that you should be able to get your 10 marks in this space that they've provided for you. But if you need more space, there's usually a little bit of a section at the back to do that. So what kind of things are they looking for? So again, it's one of these where it's banded. If you've identified some points relating to how the Equality Act should be considered, and the information is a bit basic, it's unstructured, it's not very logical, there's no supporting evidence, then you're looking at lower mark band, maximum 3. If you're a little bit more structured and your arguments are a little more reasoned and they make sense and they flow, then you're likely to end up somewhere in the middle band. If you've used subject-specific terminology and you've clearly shown your knowledge and understanding of this subject in this context, and your argument is clear and logical and substantiated with some kind of example or further evidence, then you're going to be in the higher mark band. So what are they looking for? Well, first of all, some understanding of what the EQA is. It protects staff from discrimination. So if a member of staff is going for a promotion, they shouldn't expect to be discriminated against for one reason or another. Staff can't legally be treated any differently because of a protected characteristic. So you can't deny someone promotion because they're disabled, or because they're having gender reassignment, or because they're a Muslim. Okay, if a staff member is the best candidate for the job, then they should be given their promotion regardless of anything else about them. And these protected characteristics will be stored on the staff record, which means the organisation will have no reason, if the person doesn't get the job and they've been discriminated against, they'll have no reason or excuse to say we didn't know. Okay? If application forms need to be completed, then you have to take into account that not everybody is going to be able to complete these in the way that maybe you are providing them. So maybe you have to provide them in a format that is suitable for them and their disability. Protected characteristics also shouldn't influence shortlisting of staff. So you're not really in a position to say we want to promote somebody because they're, in a civil partnership. We want to show that we're not homophobic by, promoting people who are gay, because then you're discriminating against people who are the right candidate for the job, but don't necessarily have one of these characteristics. So you're not allowed to use these characteristics to influence or shortlist staff just because they happen to have them. Okay, any protected characteristic on the staff record should just simply be ignored. It shouldn't be a determining factor as to whether you get the job or whether you don't get the job. The person who's best qualified, best experience, who has the best interview, who comes across as the best candidate for the job, they're the person who can get it, regardless of their age, disability, gender, marriage, whether they're pregnant, because of their race or religion or sexual orientation. So that's what the Equality Act is. You do need to know what the protected characteristics are. And in a question like this, you would be expected to refer to these protected characteristics. Just as if the question was about the Data Protection Act, you would be expected to understand the principles of the Data Protection Act and be able to explain them within the context of the exam question.